Well, I do have Donald Brackett on the line to talk about his book, Double Solitaire. He has been having a bit of trouble hearing me, so let's just find out if he can hear me now. How's it going,
You sound
Donald?
loud and clear now, Anna.
Fantastic. I've got you as well. Oh, brilliant. This is great. It means that we can properly chat.
Good.
So, first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about who you are, before we go into the book?
Well, Donald Brackett is a film critic, a film historian. I'm also known as an art critic. And for many years, I've really believed that films and cinema in general are actually part of the formal history of art. And that when they're at their best, they're both works of art, visual art, and also entertainment. And the book really covers a period of cinema, particularly the early days of Hollywood, in which films were both really successful commercially and also visually stunning. And the pair that I'm writing about, part of a family, really, a family connection. Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder are the partners in Double Solitaire. One was a writer and one was a producer and a director. And Charles Brackett was my great-great-grandfather's cousin. So I grew up watching movies on television like most kids do, and I had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night and going out and watching when my family was asleep. And I started watching classic movies overnight. I had a network here in Canada at one point. They used to play old movies. So I like to call them vintage movies rather than older classic. And then I saw my family name on the screen, Charles Brackett, and I began to be addicted to Hollywood films from the early era. I still am, of course, because I curate films now for Cinematheque. And a few years ago, I curated a program called Strange Magic, the films of Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder. Billy Wilder is much better known or more well-known than Charles Brackett. So part of the purpose of the book was to sort of raise awareness of the fact that they made 13 films together, many of them phenomenal classics, like Ninotchka with Greta Garbo and Lost Weekend with Ray Milland, won all sorts of Oscars. And, of course, Sunset Boulevard is their classic, phenomenal film. But Charles Brackett died early in 1969, and Billy Wilder lived on for another 30 or 40 years into 2003. And so the legend that he created of his early days sort of comfortably excluded his early partner, Charles Brackett. But I grew up really believing... there's a song by Van Dyke Parks called Movies Are Magic, and I really thought they were magic, and I still do.
Oh.
And it's a strange form of magic.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's its own unique art, isn't it? And, I mean, this isn't your first book. You've covered a variety of cultural figures, but why specifically were you drawn to explore this collaboration between Brackett and Wilder? Why that relationship? What drew you to that partnership?
Well, apart from the family connection, great-grandfather's cousin, I ended up really, first of all, I began collecting films, and I have a collection of 16mm films, classic films from Hollywood. And then a few years ago, I was curating a film program for Cinematheque called Strange Magic, and it was all 13 films made by these two partners, two very difficult partners, as I learned. And the more I did research on their films and, the story behind the films, behind the scenes, I learned that their relationship was not what it appeared on the surface to be, because they were called the happiest couple in Hollywood at one point because of the success they had from their films. But they were far from being a happy couple, and we were an extremely difficult relationship. And so after curating the film program, I then started doing more research, and I was fortunate enough to discover the private diaries of Charles Brackett, and that's when the real story of the difficulty of their relationship came about. And in fact, I also have had a long interest in creative collaboration in general, how it works, the dynamics of partnerships and the give and take, the competition and so forth. And in fact, I've written books, as you mentioned. One's on Fleetwood Mac, which isn't just a nightmare of competition, people who don't like each other but stay together forever. And then I started thinking about what makes partnerships that are so fraught with dislike, sometimes even hatred, resentment for the other partner. result in such remarkable work sometimes, not just in the film world, but in music world. And, Lennon and McCartney's a great example, Jagger and Richards of the Stones, Daltrey and Townsend of The Who. They're people who don't really like each other. But you're sort of stuck with this brilliance that happens, this genius, and your mutual muses, in a sense. So there's a kind of mutual dependence. And that's when I started thinking, well, I have to tell this story about this particular difficult relationship. And it really was a difficult one. It lasted for 13 films, and once Sunset Boulevard happened, they just couldn't cope anymore. But how they accomplished this amazing achievement is a remarkable story. And the Brackett Diaries were a real gold mine, because Billy Wilder was quite known as a raconteur. He was interviewed by anybody who would listen to him, and he sort of created a legend about himself. And the Brackett Diaries are interesting because he didn't ever do it. He was more reclusive. He was a quiet, gentlemanly guy, whereas Billy Wilder was a brash, sort of quite obnoxious. Both geniuses, but different temperaments. So how different temperaments go together was one of the fascinations for me, and I ended up exploring it through their whole partnerships.
And, I mean, was their difference in temperament, would you say, the crux of their dislike for each other? Or that apparent
totally.
dislike? Is that what caused them to have so much friction, or are there other issues going on?
Oh, no, they just really loathed each other. I mean, they were thrown together in 1936 by Paramount Studios, and they were told they were working there separately. And Brackett had been brought from New York. He was the drama critic of The New Yorker. He had written 5 novels. He was a literary kind of gentleman, and he was very well known. He was about 13 years older than Wilder, and he was brought to Hollywood to make a film from one of his novels and one of his stories. Billy Wilder escaped from Germany in 1936, by way of Berlin and then Paris, and he ended up at Paramount Studios. So there's a strange sort of destiny or fate aspect to them coming to the same studio. They didn't yet know each other, but one day one of the Paramount studio heads walked into one of their offices and picked him up and said, "Come over here." He introduced Brackett to Wilder and then said, "You're a team now." Wilder didn't even speak English at that point, literally.
Wow.
He was using a translator to write some of his films. And they collaborated on Ernst Lubitsch's film, Ninotchka, and they won an Academy Award nomination for that film. So something happened in the early relationship where Charlie really taught Billy Wilder how to speak English, and more importantly, how to speak American English. And they began writing these scripts together. The next thing you know, they almost win an Academy Award. Then they make 3 other films. At this point, they're just screenplay writers. They write together for other directors. They wrote 3 films for Mitchell Lyson, very famous films, then one for Howard Hawks in 1941. They had a problem, though, not just with each other immediately. Their temperament was just so incredibly difficult that they had a stenographer or a secretary outside their office who would hear them fighting, physically throwing things at each other. And one of them is trying to dictate to the other what to type. And it was impossible to explain why almost violence occurs, except that we know that Pete Townsend and Roger Daltrey frequently came to blows. So it's a really overheated and highly charged creative relationship when you're either writing music or making films. They sort of created an alliance together, though. First of all, they were very successful. Even though they fought, they didn't like each other, they ended up writing these incredibly scintillating, fantastic screwball comedies as well as film noir films that were very dark. They had and I think that's one of the strange manifestations of their different temperaments. They had a flair for screwball comedies like Ninotchka and Midnight and the later films that they do with Milk. Then at the same time, they were able to make dark film noir films like Lost Weekend in 1945, which did win an Academy Award. It's about alcoholism. And then Sunset Boulevard, one of the darkest films ever made about the underside of Hollywood. So this strange mixing of their temperaments resulted in this ability they had to make this kind of film. But the alliance they created was sort of an us versus them alliance. So they didn't like each other, but they also didn't like the studio heads, the corporate bosses, the directors, and the producers, who would willy-nilly just change one of their scripts. They'd change it, have the actors do the dialogue, make it up, all sorts of things. No respect for screenwriters is what they felt. So they created a pact in which they said, okay, we're going to be screenwriters together. Well, you're going to be a producer. I'm going to be a director. We won't have to, work for anybody else, which, of course, was an interesting but rather strange idea, because all that did was amplify, the difference in their temperaments. Because instead of just writing something together, they replaced the bosses that annoyed them, the control freaks that annoyed them, with each other. So they co-wrote films, starting with, Ball of Fire, I guess, and The Major and the Minor, and Double Indemnity, which is a famous film noir film, the one with Barbara Stanwyck and Fred McMurray. And it's a very murderous, sort of dark film noir film. In fact, Charlie at that point withdrew from the partnership temporarily because he didn't like the characters. There was no redemption. They were stopped being evil. I don't know if you know Double Indemnity, the film. Do you know that one, Anna?
No.
Well, another generation, perhaps. But so Raymond Chandler wrote that film instead of Charlie. But then Charles Brackett came back to the partnership once again because it was like an addiction. Why? Because they win Academy Awards together. So if they can stand being in the same room, which they could barely do, they found a way to an equation where there was a sort of détente, I guess you'd call it, where no one drops the nuclear bomb on the other. And then they launched their career as producer and director. And they win Academy Awards for those films. It was started out being a film about Hollywood and creative collaboration. Then I got the personal diaries, which were just mind-blowing in their revelation about the true relationship, because, the happiest couple in Hollywood was from a Life magazine article in '44, and it made a lot of people in Hollywood smile because it was, the exact opposite of what they were. But Charles Brackett, in one of his diaries, said that he understood the solution to their problem of hating each other. And I don't use that word lightly. He said, quote, "The thing to do was to suggest an idea, have it torn apart and despised, then a few days later it would be apt to turn up, only slightly changed, as Billy Wilder's idea. Once I got adjusted to this way of working, our lives were much simpler."
Do you think...
Weirdly, that explains it. I don't know how, but that's what they realized, if you can cope with that degree of competition. Now, the Stones are still coping with that degree of competition, and they have exactly the same relationship, the dynamic, the dependence. But, there's even more of a reason for the Stones to stay together, and Fleetwood Mac. And I wrote a book on Fleetwood Mac, and I wrote one in which the Stones were examined. So it's always the same dynamic. Now, you don't have to hate a partner or a collaborator to make great work. Surely there are people who get along. But if you really look underneath the covers of these relationships, you find a similar sort of resentment. And a balance has to be found. And that was certainly found in this case.
What I'm hearing here is that you can never know what happens behind closed doors. A toxicity can create beautiful creativity, but also the people who don't get along can find ways of making things work together. And I suppose that's a bigger and wider message than just making movies.
Oh, absolutely. That you've drawn a great conclusion from it, because it can apply to anything. In fact, John Nash, the crazy mathematician who was profiled in A Beautiful Mind, created something, eventually turned into game theory, but it was called governing dynamics, and it had to do with how to have partnerships that are not zero-sum games, where one person loses and one wins. The same was started to be applied in the United Nations in the early days, where, the compromise was necessary. And game theory is really all about non-competitive games where you cooperate together, even though you're competing. So yes, indeed, it can be applied to the real world out there. If only it could be, Anna.
It's absolutely fascinating. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk us through it and tantalise us with what it's all about. The book Double Solitaire, the films of Charles Brackett and Billy Wilder, can be purchased from the TRE bookshop. And on that note, Donald, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us.
A pleasure, Anna. Glad. Thanks for your interest.
Okay. Bye-bye.